Welcome to the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I'm Melisa Lieberman, a fellow IC and business coach. On this podcast, I teach you to become a consistently booked independent consultant without becoming a pushy salesperson or working 24/7. If I can do it, you can too. Listen on to find out how. Welcome to this week's episode, number 131 of the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I am Melisa. I'm excited to be with you here today. And we're going to dive into how to recognize imposter syndrome in your consulting business and how it could be impacting you. Almost every independent consultant that I talk to has some form or fashion of imposter syndrome. And we're going to talk more about what that means here in a minute. But I just want to tell you, if you know what I'm talking about, imposter syndrome, and are feeling like your potential clients or even your existing clients may be thinking that you are a fraud or not qualified to be doing what you're doing, whether it's selling your work or selling yourself to do the work or delivering the work or all of the above, you are not alone. And that's why I wanted to record this episode today, because it is so fascinating to me. You would think that it might be normal to feel like an imposter if you are maybe earlier in your career, or you didn't go to a certain university or any university at all, or you didn't have a certain title in corporate. That might be under the realm of possibility that you could suffer from some form of imposter syndrome. But I am telling you, there are consultants who went to Harvard, who have doctorates, who have been running a successful business for 20 or 30 years. And there is no qualification or resume or, number of years of experience that prevents you from avoiding imposter syndrome. You might have gone to Harvard. You might be in business for 20 years or 30 years. You might have an incredibly unique specialization, and it is highly likely that in some form or fashion, you're suffering from imposter syndrome and limiting yourself and your business as a result of this. So I'm just here to tell you, before we dive into the episode, that this is a rampant situation. And I'm going to tell you here in a little bit why it's actually a good thing and how to recognize it and ultimately manage it and overcome it. So you are not alone if you've got this situation going on for yourself. And I want to share with you today all about why it could be a good thing that you've got this imposter syndrome going. And if you don't have imposter syndrome going, might be a bad thing, might be something that you want to think about your business model. And I'll share with you here in a little bit why having some certain amount of imposter syndrome is actually a really good thing for your business. And if you're one of the few that doesn't suffer from it, I will say to you, you might listen to this episode because we want to get you into a place where you are pushing yourself beyond where your boundaries are currently at and getting yourself into a zone where you might have a little bit of imposter syndrome, which is a great fuel for your business. All right. So with that being said, this is your episode. So let's talk about the agenda for today. We're going to start off with what is imposter syndrome. I've already touched on that briefly, but we'll just do it a little more formally. Then we'll talk about why does imposter syndrome matter to you and your business. We'll talk about the types of independent consultants who typically get in some form of imposter syndrome, who suffers from it. And then we'll talk about how to recognize imposter syndrome. I'll give you a couple of examples, and then I'll wrap up the episode with 3 steps to manage imposter syndrome. I was going to make this a short episode, and now it's blossomed into this whole comprehensive guide to imposter syndrome for independent consultants. So stay tuned here because I've got everything for you. Okay, before we dive in to the first part of the agenda, I want to recommend a companion resource for you. It is the IC Scorecard. So it is an independent consultant's growth assessment. I've talked with you about this before. If you've already taken it, go take it again. If you've never taken it, I highly recommend it because it walks you through a handful of questions. A lot of them are related to mindset. There's a whole category on mindset, which is what we're talking about today, imposter syndrome, which is mindset. And it's really important to think about and to assess that component of your business because so much of the success of our consulting businesses is tied around the way we're thinking about ourselves and our business and our clients. So go take that if you haven't already. It's an important companion to what we're talking about today, imposter syndrome. So you can start that assessment over at icscorecard.com. So the two letters IC for independent consultant, the word scorecard.com. All right. So with that, let's dive into today's episode and the heart of it. And starting off with just making sure we're on the same page about what is imposter syndrome. You've maybe heard of this phrase before, or perhaps you haven't, but it doesn't matter. At the heart of it, it's really a specific form of self doubt. So you may be suffering from some insecurities. You may be suffering from some self doubt or some second guessing. This is incredibly common as a business owner to experience those emotions and to experience insecurity and doubt and to second guess yourself as a result of it. That is incredibly common. And today we're talking about a specific form of that, which is you worrying that other people, usually your potential clients, sometimes we worry about it more broadly, such as your former colleagues, for example. You worrying that they're going to think you're a fraud or they'll expose you as a fraud in some way. Maybe it's as simple as you posting something on LinkedIn about, what you do and your expertise and someone calling you out in the comments. Or it could be you're worried about having a sales call, a discovery call with a potential client and them asking you questions that expose you as a fraud, as someone who doesn't know, what they would expect you to know. And then as a result, feeling that intense humiliation or that intense, worry about and stress about not knowing enough or what you know doesn't count in some way. So that is what we're talking about today as it relates to imposter syndrome, that specific form of self doubt where you're worried about being exposed in some way as a fraud. It's also called fraud complex. You might hear it referred to as that. I will say very specifically, this is not a diagnosis of any form. When you use the word syndrome, it might sound like a diagnosis. It is not. We're not talking about anything medical here. We are talking about a thought process that you have, likely have. And if you don't have it, that could be a problem as well. And I'll share more about that here in a moment. But the point here is going through the process of running a business and knowing on paper that you have a certain amount of expertise and worrying that it's not enough, worrying that your potential clients will think it's not enough, and the ultimate impacts of that. That's what we're talking about here today. So, why does it matter? Why does this imposter syndrome matter? Why are we here on an episode talking about it? And really, it boils down to three things. When you have imposter syndrome, it can very easily create a scenario where you are under earning because you are discounting your expertise. You are discounting the amount of impact that you could make for your potential clients. You are discounting your background potentially. As a result, that will show up in what you're proposing to your potential clients and for how much, for what the pricing is. So, imposter syndrome will very easily lead to under earning. Imposter syndrome will also lead to you underutilizing yourself. So, let's think about it this way. Let's say you're running a boutique consultancy. Think about it in this way. And you're the CEO of that boutique consultancy. and you have consultants on the bench. In your case, you happen to be both the CEO of the boutique consultancy and the person who's on the bench, who's waiting, to get an assignment of work that they want to do and that the clients have paid for the consultancy to do. When you think about it that way, think about what kinds of projects you might be assigning to yourself when you're wearing those two different hats, and what you might be thinking that consultant on the bench is capable of doing versus you being in your head and doing all the, having one person in charge who's selling and delivering and doing all the things. Likely, if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, you're underutilizing yourself. You're not giving yourself the benefit of the doubt that you might be giving someone else who's sitting on the bench. You might not be selling the type of work that you're fully capable of because you're the one selling it. And so when you're running your business from a place of heavily weighted on imposter syndrome, it's very likely that you're underutilizing yourself. You're not selling the type of work that you're fully capable of doing, such as more retainer or strategy or advisory type work. You're selling the type of work that you could probably do when you were in your 20s, and therefore underutilizing your capabilities. The third impact of imposter syndrome when you're running your business is emotional, the emotional impact to you. Likely you started your business to feel more fulfilled, to feel more autonomous, to feel more valued for what it is that you do and the type of expertise that you have and the expertise that you want to continue building and growing. But when you allow the kind of this imposter syndrome to take a really prominent seat in the way you're thinking and running your business, it can lead to misery. Misery, that second guessing, that incessant second guessing, that insecurity, that worry and that stress, not enjoying your successes and your potential. So if you're allowing this imposter syndrome to have a prominent seat at the table, to really be something that is unmanaged in your business, it can very easily create these three things: under earning, underutilizing yourself, and unnecessary emotional misery. That's why this is so important. Now, let me say the flip side of this, and I'm going to emphasize this at several different points here today. I've already touched on it briefly, which is if you have no imposter syndrome whatsoever, it could very likely mean that you are also underutilizing yourself and under earning and potentially invoking some emotional misery as well, meaning that you're so far in your comfort zone that you're not putting yourself out there to take on work that is more challenging, that is more highly paid, and that ultimately would be more fulfilling because you're taking on a challenge, you're conquering it, and you're continuing to grow. So, the point here today of this episode is not how to get rid of imposter syndrome. In fact, if you've got no imposter syndrome whatsoever, I would suggest putting in, starting to tackle areas of your business that are not as comfortable for you, while at the same time, you don't want the other end of the spectrum happening where you've got so much imposter syndrome going on that you're creating a dynamic where you're under earning or underutilizing yourself or creating this emotional misery. So that is what I am here today to really help you to create this balance where you're not avoiding the imposter syndrome and therefore underselling yourself, while at the same time, you're not allowing so much imposter syndrome to be running the show that you are believing it. And as a result, you under earning, underutilizing, and creating more misery for yourself. All right. So let's talk about who suffers from imposter syndrome. When we started this episode, I really gave you the answer to this, which is everyone who's pushing themselves to some level. I see suffering from imposter syndrome, whether you are making 100K in your consulting business or $5 million in your consulting business or anywhere in between. It doesn't matter what experience level you have. You might be just starting out as a consultant, or you might be 30 years into your business. No one can avoid imposter syndrome based on what it looks like on paper. And like I've said before, we're not even here to try to avoid imposter syndrome. We're here to balance the imposter syndrome so that it doesn't overtake you and cause you to sell yourself so small that you're completely avoiding it, or cause you to overcorrect because it's so rampant. So that's who suffers from it. Let's talk about how to recognize it. To recognize it is the first step here. The awareness is really the key because you want to know, is this imposter syndrome preventing me from doing something that I'm just playing a lot smaller than because I don't want to experience the imposter syndrome? Or is it I'm going out and taking action and selling my work, but I'm downplaying what I'm capable of doing or underpricing myself? You really want to understand and recognize where imposter syndrome could be showing up in your business. So let's start off with really two ways to recognize this imposter syndrome. And first is the way you're thinking. So looking at your inner dialogue and noticing it. A lot of times, the things that I'll share with you here in a second sound like facts. And so we don't realize that this is our thought process that is creating this dynamic of imposter syndrome. So I'll give you a couple of examples of using a thought, noticing your thought pattern and seeing that it's a thought versus a fact as a leading indicator or as an indicator of you having imposter syndrome that could be negatively impacting your business. And that it sounds like something like this, an inner dialogue where you might be saying to yourself, oh, potential clients won't think I have the right background for this thing that I want to offer, so I'm not going to offer it. Or potential clients will figure out I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm not going to pursue this, this particular avenue. That's what it could sound like. Or even an existing client. My client isn't going to believe this recommendation that I have because they don't think I know what I'm doing. Even after you've landed a client, this is a very common dialogue that can happen. So the awareness is key. Noticing what kinds of thoughts you're having that are creating this dynamic of imposter syndrome. The other great indicator that you can leverage in order to notice and be aware of this imposter syndrome happening in your business is from the emotions that you're experiencing. If you're feeling insecure, if you're feeling doubt, if you're feeling defensive or shame, those are great indicators to say, you know what, something is going on here. It's very normal to have these kinds of feelings as a business owner and an entrepreneur. It's important to know where they're coming from. They're coming from the way you're thinking about yourself and the way you're thinking about your clients and the way you think your clients are thinking about you. And so using those feelings as an indicator to say, you know what, I need to slow down a little bit and figure out what's going on in my thought process here. We have no idea what your clients or your potential clients are thinking about you. But when you're thinking they're thinking things about you that you don't have the right background or you don't know what you're doing or you don't know as much as you should or you don't know as much as other people know in this space, this is an incredibly important thing to notice and to pause and to address before you keep running on that inner dialogue and taking action from it, which means that you will undersell yourself, underutilize yourself, and create this sort of misery loop, if you will. So, using those two concepts, noticing your inner dialogue, noticing the way you're feeling as indicators to say, you know what, I need to take a pause here, notice what is going on, and leveraging awareness for yourself to recognize imposter syndrome. So often we're just in this go, go, go mode, right? We're running from this client meeting to that client meeting to potentially trying to fit in a little bit of lead generation. And as a business owner, one of the biggest mistakes that is so easy to make is not making time to think, not making time to be able to create some awareness about what's going on in your mind, what's going on in your emotional state. And as a result, if you're operating off of that autopilot, you're going to continuously create the same results for yourself. You're going to continuously make the same amount of money, plus or minus a little bit. You're going to continue that feast or famine cycle if that's what you're already creating. You're going to continuously attract and find the same types of clients with the same types of engagements. If you're at the place where you want to break away from that and start making more money, start taking on more interesting and challenging engagements, start working with clients potentially in a different way, it's so important to take a moment and see where the way you're thinking about yourself and your business and your clients, taking that pause and using it to recognize this imposter syndrome and where it might be holding you back is incredibly important. So, how to recognize imposter syndrome, take a little bit of time, leverage those two trigger points that I just gave you, which is noticing this inner dialogue and notice those feelings that you might be having as great indicators to say, you know what, I need to investigate this more. This can be tricky though, because sometimes the way we're thinking or even the way we're feeling feels very reasonable or justified or pragmatic, that these are just facts of the situation and they're not movable, they're not anything other than facts. And so we don't question them. And so that's tricky, but not insurmountable. It leads me to talk with you about the but Melisa part of this. Well, but Melisa, it's true that I don't have a degree from Harvard, but Melisa, it's true that I haven't done this, type of advisory work before. And so it's going to be really hard for me to get a client to believe I can do this. Whatever your but Melisas are here that feel very factual, I want to challenge you to say, first of all, that's not helpful at all. Maybe what you're telling me is true. You don't have a degree from Harvard. Does it even matter? I will tell you time and time again, it does not. It might matter for one client who's, looking very specifically for a certain skill set and is a Harvard alum and won't accept anything else. That could be true. But on the macro level, I guarantee you it is not true. You don't have a disadvantage because you didn't go to Harvard. You do not have a disadvantage because you haven't done a retainer type of a client before, for example. These things are not true that they are a limitation for you, that if you don't have them, you're an imposter. Instead, it's the opposite. Starting to look at about what you're thinking is not true. So, for example, I'll tell you, so often consultants tell me, I'm so bad at business development. I'm so bad at selling. I just don't have experience. I relied on corporate salespeople in the past. On paper, that could be true. You may feel like an imposter. I'm not a salesperson. I feel like they're going to figure that out, that I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to negotiate, and they're going to take advantage of me. That would be very common to think that. I will tell you that is not true. As I work with my clients, in consultants like you, and we start to unpack what it is that feels so true, I'm not a salesperson, we realize that it is not the case. For example, in the past, it's likely that you have been a subject matter expert and helped support a salesperson in landing certain work for your old company. You may not have gone on the sales calls, but you were supporting that sales organization or that marketing organization with content, with examples, with case studies. You have been part of a sales process before. Or let's say that you haven't had that experience. It's very likely that you have sold an idea to a client in the past. You sold an idea internally that people may not have necessarily been on board with right away. Thinking about and unraveling what it is that you feel is not true and that therefore you're an imposter, a fraud, is so important to really get clear with yourself that you do have the relevant experience. It might not look exactly the way that you're thinking it should look, but you have relevant experience. So it's not so black and white. And that's what I want to say to you today in this But Melissa section. It may feel very true that you don't have X, Y, or Z that feels very required to land the type of work that you want to be doing at the prices that you want to be charging your clients. And here to tell you that it almost always down to the letter is not true. There's a gray area in between for you to figure out, what do I have that is relevant here? What have I done in the past that is related? And therefore, I have this type of experience to bring to the table, and I'm not an imposter. So that is so important to recognize that it's the way that you're thinking, which is oftentimes very binary, black and white. I either have this or I don't. And noticing what could be in the middle where you're not giving yourself credit. Okay, so let's go into a couple of examples to bring this to life. The first example is one from a client who wanted to move from staff augmentation to retainer type work. They had been doing a lot of, I'll call it staff augmentation type of work in the course of their consulting business, where they were coming on board, maybe even for a specific project for a given client, and then kind of turning into an extra pair of hands. They're very senior type of a consultant, but it always tended to turn into some kind of staff augmentation flavor for them. And they wanted to get more into retainers where they were doing advisory type work, strategy type work, and not rolling up their sleeves, actually doing a lot of any execution. So they wanted to get out of that day to day execution and get into a place where they didn't feel so unfulfilled, underpaid, making it hard to take time off. But their thought process here was, clients don't see me as strategic. Clients don't see me as strategic. And so when I go to sell, I'm a fraud. They don't think I'm strategic. And her thought process was, they're questioning, what is she doing here, trying to sell me this retainer? Even new clients, not even clients that she had had a history with. And so she felt like she was an imposter in this way. She didn't feel like she had the right track record from a consulting perspective. She had been pigeonholed in the kinds of work she was doing. And as we dug into it, the truth of the matter was, it had nothing to do with whether the potential clients would see her as strategic or not, or whether the potential clients would think she was a fraud or not. It was that she didn't see herself as strategic. Her thought process about herself and her experience was so far skewed onto this extra pair of hands kind of identity for herself that she didn't see herself as strategic. So, of course, she would be assuming that potential clients would think she was a fraud. They'll find out that I don't know what I'm doing, was one of the things that she shared. This is a perfect example of how imposter syndrome grabs hold. It feels very real that I don't have these things on paper. And so, therefore, the clients won't believe me that I am capable of doing this different type of work. And as a result, in her case, it was leading her to consistently really want to move into a different type of engagement, into providing more strategic type of a work, but never making it past the stage of finding clients who wanted that kind of day to day execution. It wasn't because of her resume. It wasn't because of her case studies. It wasn't because of the portfolio of work that she had done in the past. The reason why she was stuck and not landing those more strategic retainer type engagements was because of the way she was thinking about herself. She was not thinking of herself as someone who was strategic. She was not thinking of herself as someone who was incredibly value from an advisory perspective. And as a result, she was not portraying that to her end clients. And so, if you boil it down, it's really just imposter syndrome can be a very elegant way to avoid fear of rejection, avoid fear of sounding not as polished when you're selling a new type of service, like in this case, the retainers, And so it can sound, we put all these excuses on the table of, well, I don't have this, or my track record isn't that. And the client's going to think I'm a fraud. And therefore I'm going to, keep doing what I'm doing. Essentially, this is an elegant way of you avoiding some, in this case, she was avoiding, but if you're doing this, you avoiding too, that fear of rejection, that fear of attempting to do something new in your business and not being great at it from the outset. So to wrap up this story, the solution here was number one, to the awareness of all of these thought processes that she had of where she wasn't good enough, or where she didn't have the right background, where she didn't have the right track record. Recognizing those thought processes, which were imposter syndrome related thought processes, being really clear that it was thought processes she had, not hard and cold facts about how business works, so that it gave her the opening to say, you know what, it's possible that the clients I really want to work with that will see what I do as valuable will want to engage with me as a retainer. To open that little crack, going from imposter syndrome, this is not possible, to opening the little crack to say, you know what, it's possible that I do have the right and valuable experience and that clients will want to hire me to do this type of work. And so as a result, she was able to start having conversations with potential clients, to do some market research with potential clients, to dial in her messaging, to give herself the permission that she didn't need to know all the answers, that no consultant can possibly know all of the answers. That's not even the requirement. And ultimately to landing retainer clients. So hopefully that brings to life this idea of how imposter syndrome could be limiting you when you're thinking about this story, and how it might be applied to you, how it shows up, what the approach is to recognize it, and then ultimately a few tools to overcome that, and the ultimate result you could get from it. All right, let's talk about one more story, and then I'll tell you how to pull this together into a formula for yourself to manage imposter syndrome. The second example I'll give you is an example of raising prices. So I had a consultant, they had a $1 million business. So again, this imposter syndrome happens to all of us. They didn't reach some sort of like pinnacle of $1 million and everything was rosy. This happens to all of us. So they had a business that was generating over $1 million, but were really at the place where they were overworking. They hadn't raised prices in 3 or 4 years, and they didn't see themselves as an expert. Still making all of that money, being really sought after in the industry, being asked to do a lot of speaking and that kind of thing. They still didn't see themselves as an expert. And they saw themselves as someone who only landed work because they were the lowest cost option in that specific industry for that type of consulting. So you can see where this imposter syndrome was creating this dynamic of under earning and being in this case, both underutilized because they were, kind of getting a lot of the work that no one else wanted, and also not being leveraged at the level that they were capable of being leveraged in terms of their level of knowledge and expertise and what they had to bring, all of that body of knowledge and work that they had to bring to bear for their clients. So that was the before, the picture of what imposter syndrome looked like for this particular independent consultant that was one of my coaching clients. And the approach that we took was, again, really understanding and parsing out what is the difference between a justification about why the pricing should stay where it was and why they would lose clients if they increase the pricing, and recognizing all of those justifications as excuses to keep the status quo in place. Those are not hard and fast rules about business. We just kept digging and digging and really understanding that the root of this was the imposter syndrome thoughts, the worry that they wouldn't land any more clients if they charged an appropriate amount based on the value that they were delivering. The idea that they were to raise their prices, they would be able to make more impact for their clients because they would be working with clients who valued the type of work that they do. And so uncovering, again, parsing out the difference between market conditions and imposter syndrome thoughts that were creating this place where this consultant was stuck. And they weren't stuck at a bad place, right? In the sense of revenue, they were stuck at a bad place in terms of emotionally and overworking. But this was so important to recognize the difference between the market conditions and the imposter syndrome thoughts that were holding them back. And then getting them to the place of working together to really do a couple of things, shift the way that they were running a sales process to better understand the potential client's pain points and the value, and building up and articulating the value at the same time as rebuilding their own identity as a consultant and as a business owner to really own the expertise and the knowledge that they do have versus focusing in on what they don't have or what they think they don't have. That was the work. It wasn't about really strategy or tactics of a process here. It was so much about the mindset side of this and overcoming the imposter syndrome using those types of tools. And the result was the ability for this particular consultant to raise their prices by 50% and to start attracting higher quality consulting clients who really valued the expertise that they had to bring to the table. So, to pull all of this together for you, the formula to manage your imposter syndrome, and this is the type of work that I do with my coaching clients, is to help them figure out where is imposter syndrome limiting them in their business, or are they so afraid of imposter syndrome and putting themselves out there that they're just keeping themselves incredibly limited. This is the type of work that we do together. And the types of steps that we use are: number one, expect this to happen. You're selling your expertise, you're selling yourself and your work with a client. Of course, this is going to happen. Expect that this is going to happen. And again, if you don't have some form of imposter syndrome, then I think it's a great signal to you that to say it's very possible you're not pushing yourself far enough out of your comfort zone. So step one is expect this is happening. Step two is to be aware. The first step of this process to manage the imposter syndrome and not let it prevent you from pursuing the type of work you want to be doing for the type of income you want to be doing it for is to be aware. Notice where you're limiting yourself because of imposter syndrome versus because of some hard and cold facts about the market. Notice it, be aware of it. It's based on that internal dialogue and your emotional state. Then put in the steps to manage it. I gave you a couple of examples in those stories, and to disprove it. So those are the steps for you to be aware of and start managing imposter syndrome in your business. And I don't forget to go take that independent consultant scalability assessment at icscorecard.com. And I will see you again next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melissalieberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.